Hello fellow YouTubers, and welcome to episode 10, reading my first self-published novel, Aggravation. Yes, I'm wearing a cap, and the reason is that the light reflects off my forehead, and I noticed there's been a lot of glare in some shots, and I'm looking at the wrong thing again. It's over here, isn't it? Clyde was certain of that. Even though his experience with the supernatural was that of a novice, his past encounters with it gave him every reason to believe that that was true. He was also confident that there wasn't any need to check the computer images, for they too would show the same thing. So, after placing the prints on the desktop, he brought up the sister's writings and began to read, even though he was ever mindful that the washing up was ready and waiting to be done. It wasn't important. He would take care of it when he returned to the kitchen to brew a pot of tea. And Father did delight in our breasts, and the more endowed we became, the more delight he took in them, to the point that he became obsessed with them, never able to resist handling, licking, sucking, and rubbing his thing between them. The thing that raped and sodomized us countless times. His manhood, as he referred to it, although he did call it other things. Those times when he seemed to be possessed, perhaps under the influence of a narcotic. His physical strength, unlike that of an ordinary man. His lust for us insatiable, heightening our fear and loathing for this man that was our father. Yet we were defenceless against him, and dare not say a word against him to anybody, firm in our belief as Father was, that no one would believe a word against his, for we were children, and as children we were nobodies, whereas he was held in high regard, a respected member of the community. There was a constant threat nonetheless, that if we told and were believed, our demise at his hands would be swift and merciless, for a condemned man has nothing to lose. And we never doubted his threats, not for a moment, nor did Mother, for she too lived in fear of this man by now. So much so that when he decided to sell Isabella, Mother dared not challenge that decision. We weren't allowed to say goodbye to Isabella when the man came to take her away, but we chorused her name as we wept, in our bedroom where Father commanded we should go. We tried to think of one word to describe our feeling for Father on that day, Saturday, February 2nd, 1935. But in the end we had to cede to the impossible, for no such word exists in the English language. A little more than 3 months later, on the day we turned 15, Tuesday, May 7, and at a time we thought our lives, our very existence, couldn't possibly get any worse, they did. On the evening of that day, as we sat at the dining room table, our meal finished, Father told us that our school days were over, and first thing tomorrow morning we would commence working at the pharmacy. He had often said that he loathed paying wages, but it was something he had to do in order to be able to serve and satisfy his customers. And now it seemed that his patience had been rewarded. As for Mrs. Edmondson, the woman who had been in his employ for longer than Henrietta and I could remember, no longer existed in Father's eyes, her service no longer required. So we began our employ, our slave labour, and with it endless opportunities for Father to molest us, to touch and feel and press his body against us, and always with that look on his face, a lecherous sneer of one who is morally corrupt, depraved, and beyond redemption, and his eyes lascivious and full of sexual desire. We did not expect he would have a change of heart and pay us for our toil, for he had no heart, so when he didn't we were not disappointed. Instead, he began to pay us, like he would a prostitute or a kept woman, for sexual favours, smiling as he tossed a 10-shilling or £1 note on our beds as we, father's twin whores, lay naked, debauched and covered with his spent seed, thankful at least for that one small mercy, but forever fearful that we may still fall pregnant. At first we ignored the money, looking at it for what it was and what it represented, filthy lucre for degradation, finally deciding to put it aside for a chance for gaining redemption at a later time in another place. We had no idea when that time would come or where we would go to, but the thought of escape gave us hope where before there hadn't been nothing but despair. Little did we know that in less than a year our lives in general would change forever, and that our quest for freedom would come without so much as a change of address, let alone in geography. With our work at the pharmacy we began to learn, first with the medicines and healthcare products already made and sold over the counter, along with a cornucopia of perfumes, toiletries and personal items for men, women, children and babies, the extent of which overwhelmed us in the beginning. But in little more than 3 months Father demanded that each of us in turn assist him with what seemed to us an endless production of tonics, elixirs, tinctures, infusions, lotions, creams, salves, powders and tablets. And as we did so we remembered the substances under his instructions we gathered from and would later return to shelves and drawers, then writing them down for future reference should we need to avail ourselves of any or all for our own personal use. Father refused us medications, leaving it to Mother to dispense our now and then requests for something to ease the pain of menstruation when sometimes incurred, or a dose of castor oil if she thought we looked pale and perhaps constipated. She gained immense satisfaction from the administration of that ghastly syrup, her face aglow, eyes wide, as she filled a tablespoon as we looked on, standing side by side in trepidation of the forceful way in which she thrust the spoon and contents into our mouths, not daring to gag or worse still vomit, for to do so would result in a thrashing. As for our breasts, notably the nipples and orali, that were constantly sore from Father's sucking and groping, she reluctantly suggested honey, which much to our surprise and subsequent relief proved beneficial. It also proved to be something that Father relished, insisting we coat our breasts with it from now on because he savoured the eroticism it provided. And we did, he made sure of that, placing a large jar of honey on the cabinet that separated our 2 single beds for just that purpose. Unfortunately, for us his wants and experimentations knew no boundaries, and it wasn't long before the honey was smeared on other parts of our bodies as well. Fucking hell, Clyde muttered, shaking his head. But the honey would work to our advantage, although we didn't know that then. By the time that year of 1934 gave way to the new year of 1936, we had learned much from Father, and with that knowledge we yearned for more, and with it we planned the eventual demise of our tormentor. "Oh my God," Clyde said. "They killed him. They murdered their father. He deserved nothing less, but Jesus H. Christ, they killed the son of a bitch. No wonder they hid their diaries." That thought occurred to me, Henrietta, just before Christmas 1935, but I lacked the courage initially to mention it to my sister, afraid that she would think ill of me. I should have known better. When I eventually took that bold step early January 1936, she confessed to me that she had had the same thought, but like me was too afraid to speak of it for fear of what I might think of her. And because we had grown up very quickly, it came as no surprise to us because of it, that when we spoke of our scheme the words flowed off our tongues as smooth as silk, and for the first time in a long, long time we were able to look forward to something, and we delighted in it. Undeniably, it was cool and calculated, but to us it seemed the most logical thing to do. Made all the better because the man who was our jailer and defiler had unknowingly given us access to the tools of his profession that would eventually end his life. And we delighted in that too. We delighted also in the wicked way in which we decided to poison him, even though at the time we had no idea of what we could use. We were aware by now of the poisons available to us: potassium cyanide, strychnine and arsenic. But we were positive that Father's sense of smell and taste would be exemplary, so exceptional that whichever one we decided to use must possess the properties of being tasteless, odourless, and could not be absorbed by the skin. The latter was paramount to our plan, for without it we would lose the immense satisfaction we rightfully deserved. That the breast he licked and sucked and was so obsessed would end his life from the toxin that coated them. Clyde slumped back in his chair, his mind devoid of all thoughts. He was completely aware of what he just read, but the magnitude of it was spellbinding. For several silent moments, Clyde stared at the screen, fingers steepled, forefingers pressed to his lips, after which his writer's mind kicked in with, ingenious. That's what it is. Absolutely ingenious. Agatha Christie, eat your heart out. Just goes to show what people are capable of and the extraordinary lengths they will go to when they're pushed to the breaking point. Leaning forward, forearms resting on the desk, he asked himself, I wonder which one they used. He was well aware that all would be revealed. At least he hoped so. But he was trying to think, running thoughts through his mind, what little he knew of the three poisons, and crossing them out as he went, for all three, as far as he was aware, didn't contain the three properties the sisters so desired. Resigned, he continued to read. We expected our research would take but little time, even though our limited opportunity to consult the vast library of books and journals Father kept in his office at the pharmacy was when he went to lunch. Fortunately, he was a creature of habit, leaving the pharmacy at precisely 12 noon Monday through Friday for a counter lunch at the commercial tavern, leaving us to lunch on whatever it was we had managed to put together that morning before leaving the house. We didn't care. For 40 minutes he would be away, and we made the most of that time day after day, taking turns going through those books of interest, while the other remained on vigil, ready to signal a warning with two sharp, quick coughs, should he by chance return early. Our excuse for being out back the need to visit the laboratory. Yet I, Harriet, could not help be in awe of the knowledge contained in those books and that Father possessed regardless of the man he was, for it was all but beyond me. In less than a fortnight we had finished our research, and with it so many conflicting reports. Some stated that arsenic was odourless, others that it wasn't, although the general consensus was that only a few could smell it. So too with taste, as it was with potassium cyanide and strychnine, with only arsenic unable to be absorbed by the skin. Arsenic, though, like strychnine, produces dramatic and painful symptoms, whereas potassium cyanide produces coma within a minute or two. Our hopes were dashed. How silly we were. Our initial thoughts and our actions because of them were those of two 15-year-old girls seeking the impossible that we were certain existed to commit the unthinkable, when all along the answer was as plain as the nose on our faces. The honey. If we mix cyanide with the honey, we surmised, would not the honey mask any smell, should there be one? And also, would not the honey protect our skin from absorption? Excited by the revelation, we decided to experiment. The abundance of potassium cyanide at the pharmacy was almost comparable to that of the sugar Father sweetened his tea and coffee, so we weren't hesitant in acquiring a small amount, confident that he would never know any of it was missing. Our plan was to place a small amount of the cyanide honey mixture on one wrist of one only for an hour every day for 7 days. That way, if that person became ill and the other didn't, we would know for certain that that illness was caused by the absorption through the skin regardless of the honey. That didn't happen. Completely satisfied and firm in our belief that because Father was always hungry for our breast, what little smell or taste there might be would not be realised by him until it was too late. Father collapsed naked on the floor of our bedroom Wednesday night, March 18. The noise of his impact alerting Mother, who, seeing him in such a state, didn't hesitate in ordering us to dress and help her manhandle him to the double bed in the master bedroom where, after dressing him in pyjamas and placing the covers over him, she then phoned Dr. Bellows. Father was dead long before Dr. Bellows arrived some 15 minutes later, and, following the mandatory examination of Father's body, was satisfied he had passed away peacefully in his sleep from cardiac arrest, saying that he had warned Father time and time again that his blood pressure was abnormally high and he should take note of it and look after himself. There was no mention of a post-mortem, nor was one forthcoming. 2 days later Father was buried, and we celebrated his passing. For Mother, Father's sudden death was not unexpected, and with it came a change in the likes of which surprised us. To begin with, on the early afternoon after returning home from Father's funeral, she sat down with us at the kitchen table and told us how glad she was that he was dead. We were glad too, but we weren't about to voice our opinion. She then begged for our forgiveness, for all the hurt she had subjected us to, for the mother she should have been but never was, for allowing Father to do the horrible things he did to us so often. And we said we did, but that was a lie. There was no forgiveness in our hearts. There never would be. All that we would ever have was each other, and whatever we owned and were likely to own, no matter how inconsequential, we would never rid ourselves of it. Clyde had carried out a little research into hoarding, and he had found that in many cases it was directly related to some deep-rooted psychological trauma of childhood, which for the sisters was the virtual absence of one. To their minds, what they experienced as children was not being children in the eyes of their parents, but rather something to be used and abused. So in order to get back what was lost to them forever, they would eventually, with the exception of food, be prompted to keep everything, rather than let it go never to be seen again, as it was with their childhood. With Father gone, Mother had to act quickly in order to keep the pharmacy open and operating as usual. And with that she found an ally in Dr. Bellows. He arranged for a locum to take over, but in the interim, the week before said locum arrived, he, with our assistance, maintained the production of prescription medicines. It was a wonderful experience for Henrietta and me to work alongside a man of such delightful demeanour, so far removed as we were now from the despotic tyrant that had once ruled our lives, our very existence. To be talked to rather than talked at, to be requested rather than ordered, to be appreciated rather than used, to be able to laugh where before there was nothing to laugh at, and to be paid for the work we did now that wasn't work anymore, where before we worked for nothing and hated it. And when the locum, Mr. Chadwick, arrived, we were happy to find that he also was a pleasant individual, kind and considerate and seemingly at ease with our presence, impressed when he learned of our knowledge and what we were capable of. Perhaps it was because we were the owner's daughters that he complimented us so, not wanting to fall foul of our mother, who was then and would always be, to those who knew no different, a force to be reckoned with. We knew differently, of course, for her facade had been penetrated, open and laid bare, and we were no longer the fools we once were. And because of our position in the pharmacy, we were at liberty to avail ourselves the books of the library at a whim, taking them home, reading them at our leisure, then marking our page before casually putting them aside to continue at another time, safe in the knowledge that no one would dare to demand their return. We took particular interest in those books that were dedicated to alternative medicines and herbal remedies, only becoming aware of their existence during our research period, the result of which began our interest in the science that was thousands of years old. It was as if we had returned to school but without the regimen dictated of one, free as we were to study if we so desired, but also free to dismiss it should we choose not to do so. To be able to choose, to have options, is a simple thing that many take for granted, but to us it was new and all-encompassing, a truly wonderful thing. It was a life so different from the one we once lived that we revelled in it, buying a bicycle each so we could travel to places near and not so far, loving the freedom, the sun on our faces, the wind in our hair, the sheer exhilaration of freewheeling downhill, the exertion of trying to pedal up steep inclines, an act of utter futility, but one we relished the challenge of, or part of being born again, to be young and alive and so invigorated, and so aware of what was going on about us. Perhaps now in hindsight we should have gained our driver's licence, but at the time we had not the money to purchase a motor vehicle, and the mere thought of driving fathers left nothing to be desired. So Mother sold it, and damn good riddance, we thought, dividing the money between the three of us, an act that was as generous as much it was beyond our beliefs, our wildest imaginations. But it didn't end there. On the day we celebrated our 16th birthdays, May 7, 1936, a Thursday, we returned home from work to find that Mother had prepared a special meal and baked and decorated a birthday cake. Only one of only two that we could remember, and so full of genuine of what she thought was love but we took as friendship, that we wondered if perhaps she was under the influence of a narcotic. But no, that wasn't the case, nor was she inebriated from drinking too much of the elderberry wine she delighted in so often. Instead, she was under the influence of well-being, of someone who has seen the light and rejoiced in it, and no doubt thankful for our presence, for not leaving her alone when doing so would have been so easy. She was a totally different woman now, and we luxuriated in it, even though we were still mindful of the past and not prepared to take anything for granted. Yet the biggest surprise of that late afternoon was the gift of a sun hat she bestowed on each of us, saying as she did so, "If you must go out and about on those bicycles, you need to protect your faces from the sun." Then she had smiled, a gesture that was now somewhat commonplace, where once before it was a rarity. But even rarer than that had been the loosening of the purse strings, but not any more. She had confessed to feeling sorry for Mrs. Edmondson when Father had abruptly terminated her employ, so in order to make restitution, she had called on her personally to apologise for her now-deceased husband's abhorrent behaviour, and would reinstate her forthwith, should she so desire, with an increase in salary worthy of her position and the high regard she, Mother, held for her. In the past, such a statement to the latter would have been a falsehood, but now it could be taken with all the sincerity it implied. Needless to say that Mrs. Edmondson agreed, and Henry and I welcomed her back with open arms. Mr. Chadwick had returned to Sydney following his 5-week stay, but had returned a fortnight later to resume his position on a permanent basis. Being the gentleman he was and in all good conscience, he thought it was only fitting that he should give notice in person, thereby giving his employer a little leeway in order to appoint a suitable replacement. During his 2-week absence, Dr. Bellows came to the force once again. The man was nothing less than a saint. In appreciation for his services, both past and present, Mother decided to present him with a special gift. Aware that he had a passion for hunting and fishing, she sought the advice of Mr. Ferguson, the owner of the local hardware store. Besides the products befitting such a store, Mr. Ferguson sold a wide range of sporting goods including rifles and shotguns. Mother was prepared to spare no expense, for what price could be put on such unparalleled generosity, compassion and consideration. Delighted to hear that money was no object, Mr. Ferguson recommended a Case Holland & Holland double shotgun, informing Mother that an order would have to be placed with the London-based firm, and that it could take up to a year for the order to be filled. That didn't matter. The only problem was that Mother, Mr. Ferguson, Henrietta and I couldn't remember if he was right or left-handed, a critical matter for the purchase of such a fine gun. After much deliberation, Mother and Mr. Ferguson were certain he was right-handed, whereas Henrietta was certain he was ambidextrous, which is why I was certain he was left-handed. The solution to our dilemma, however, was an easy one. Because Dr. Bellows was a regular customer, Mr. Ferguson would hand him a gun under the guise of wanting his opinion of it, noting then which shoulder he threw the weapon. 2 days later that proved to be the right. Problem solved. The order was placed. The waiting then began. The gun arrived in the first week of winter 1937, the presentation following a dinner Mother had prepared for the occasion. The result of receiving such an exquisite and totally unexpected gift, leaving Dr. Bellows speechless. When his voice finally found him, he had said a heartfelt thank you to Mother, going on to say that it would be something he would treasure always, and his only regret that he wouldn't live another 100 years to truly appreciate such a fine gun. And even then, that wouldn't be long enough. The reason we decided to write this particular episode was to highlight the enormous change in our mother and the subsequent revealing of the wealth she possessed that we had never before been privileged to. We had always thought that Father was a self-made man, and to a certain degree that was true. But the wealth of Mother's father, part of which she had inherited following his death, paled his worth into insignificance by comparison. Hang on a minute, Clyde said, prompted by a sudden revelation. Now that I think of it, no mention was made of any money being left to the Salvation Army. Both Sandy and Bob Lawrence had said the house and its contents had been left to them, but they didn't say anything about what must have been a considerable amount of money. Sitting back in his chair, so what happened to it? Where's the money now? And more importantly, how much money are we talking about? Although Mother's family history is as relevant as it is deep-rooted, there is no need to delve into it, except to say in her words, I'd inherited handsomely. Added to her personal worth, she had been Father's sole beneficiary, which hadn't surprised Henrietta and me in the least. And we had no idea what that represented monetarily. But with our work at the pharmacy, we became well versed as to the revenue it generated. So by that knowledge alone, we had every reason to believe it was considerable. By the time Harriet and I celebrated our 21st birthdays, the world had been at war for 2 years, with many of the young men that had frequented the pharmacy in the past, and we had innocently flirted with now and then, off overseas doing their utmost for the Commonwealth and, tragically, sacrificing their lives as they heroically did battle for that cause. For the parents and siblings and loved ones so many left behind, the fear they held for those so far away was all too obvious on their faces, in their eyes, their voices speaking so often as to the not knowing and the uncertainty of it all. Some were optimistic that the war would be over in no time at all, but they were the same ones who had been optimistic from the very beginning. Sooner or later, though, we all knew they would be right. On that Wednesday, May 7, 1941, in honour of our coming of age, Mother suggested it was high time that we sit for a series of photographs, as individuals, a pair, and as a family. A delightful idea, and one we were only too happy to oblige her. Before Father's passing, there had been a plethora of family photographs scattered throughout the house. for he was firm of the opinion that a family's history should be recorded so. Although, if the truth be known, he was as much narcissistic as he was egotistic. But on the night of the day of his interment, Mother rid the house of all said photographs. The reason all too obvious, and her actions we silently applauded her for. Oh well, Clyde quipped, that's another mystery solved. As a result of that sitting, she ordered several copies of each in order to grace the lounge room, dining room, sitting room and our bedrooms. Their presence at first pleasing to our eyes and bringing warmth to our hearts. A constant reminder how good things were now. But it wasn't long, perhaps 2 months, before they began to haunt Henrietta and me. As we looked at our eyes looking back at us, staring at us, we were reminded of the obscenities done to us, and as a result we blamed ourselves for letting it happen. Clyde didn't say anything, but he was thinking, how often do we hear of the abused blaming themselves for letting it happen? Jesus. We tried to convince ourselves that we weren't to blame time and time again, but the more we tried, the more convinced we became that we were. That we'd been nothing more or better than harlots, accepting money for services rendered under the guise that it would be our saviour, our means to an end. And we began to think too, that maybe we were cold-blooded murderers after all, where before we hadn't looked at it as being anything but what he justly deserved. But now we began to each other, what right did we have to be judge, jury and executioner? Who were we to sit in judgment when we had the opportunities, regardless of his threats, to notify the authorities of his crimes? Why didn't we point the finger and make accusations when Police Sergeant Stanley stood before the counter? Or when his constable did the same? So many questions, so much doubt. If we knew then what we know today about opiates, perhaps we could have blamed, and felt better because of it, the effect of the substance Father mixed with our hot chocolate for our actions, even though we had but few and minor withdrawal symptoms because of it. I'd wondered about that, Clyde muttered. So we remained self-accused, the blame resting squarely on our shoulders. The only option to offset our guilt, the not looking at the photographs, made easy our bedroom by placing the frames face down on our bedside cabinet, but with always in our minds that we must remember to stand them erect first thing in the morning, to be as Mother would expect them to be. It would be 29 years before we would be able to permanently rid ourselves of all photographs in the house. Adamant then that we would never be photographed again. There you go, Clyde. There's always a logical explanation for just about anything. And then I thought, yes, well, that may be so, but I sure hope the sisters can enlighten me at the logic behind thinking there's a pyramid buried under or inside Tor Hill, for I sure as hell haven't got a clue. Feeling the need then for something to nibble on to wash it down with, Clyde went to the kitchen, only to be reminded that there was washing up to be done. He was keen to return to his office and continue reading, but he had to brew a pot of tea regardless, and there wasn't a lot of washing up to be done, so he might as well do it as he waited for the jug to boil and while he waited for the tea to draw. By the time he had finished pre-washing as a prelude to the final washing up, the jug had boiled, and a fresh pot of tea was resting under the cosy, and by the time the tea had drawn he had finished washing up and drying, then said, sometimes it's the mere thought of having to do something that puts us off doing it, rather than the doing of it in the first place. He was always making such statements of fact based on observation, a habit born decades ago from the reading of Sherlock Holmes, the master of deductive reasoning. And he thought it was a good habit too, so beneficial for a writer even if some thought it was a tad peculiar. Most of those people were the egotistical types who felt vulnerable and emotionally hurt because they suddenly realised that they lacked that very capacity themselves, that they didn't know existed in anyone else, but should exist in them now that they did, but it didn't. In other words, their egos suddenly take a nosedive and they resort to criticism because of it. Clyde thought in a roundabout way that description suited Charlie Spare No Expense Jessup to a T. After pouring a mug of tea, a lucky dip in the biscuit barrel, Clyde returned to his desk, settled in his chair, crunched a Scotch finger biscuit, sipped his tea, then continued to read. But on the third night of placing our photographs face down on the bedside cabinet, as we lay in our beds, being denied sleep, the only light that of moonbeams entering the bedroom window, we heard a noise that was almost immediately followed by movement, that at first we thought was that of the window curtain caught in a breeze, but a quick turn of our heads proved that not to be so. A moment or two later, perhaps woken by instinct alone, Ruffles, poor old Ruffles, curled up as always at the foot of one bed, began a soft mewing that quickly became a hissing, as if seeing or sensing or both that someone or something was in the room that shouldn't be there, and its very presence was threatening. I remember whispering to Harriet, "It's the boogeyman." The boogeyman. Me, an adult who should have known better, that no such creature exists, was suggesting that very thing to my sister nonetheless. Then, as if by magic, the picture frames that were lying flat began to rise, so slowly at first that we thought it but a figment of our imaginations, only to be certain as we continued to watch wide-eyed that it was anything but. Too terrified to move, we could only watch on, seeing in the light of the moon what we couldn't believe, the continuing rise of the frames like the opening of a trapdoor, hinged to a stay by a hand that couldn't be seen. So afraid that I suddenly felt a hint of dampness between my legs, and I wondered if Harriet had succumbed to her fear likewise. I told myself that I should close my eyes and try to will whatever it was away, and to pull the bed covers up over my head like I did when a child, for nothing could harm me then when I'd be treated so. But I didn't do that. Instead, I continued to stare at those frames, mesmerised as surely as a mouse is held under the spell of a cat's eyes, as it waits for the end that is nigh. And when the frames finally settled upright, 100, 1,000 heartbeats later, one word was spoken that chilled me to the bone. Look. And we did look, and what we saw made us tremble, for there in the photographs where only Harriet and I had been seated, was another figure standing between and behind us. And though the light from the moon was dappled by the curtains and waning, there was no doubt in our minds whatsoever that that figure was our father, and we wept, silently, so as not to wake Mother. When I woke the following morning from a sleep that I thought would be impossible, lying on my back staring at the ceiling, I tried to convince myself that what had happened didn't happen at all and was but a nightmare, and that there was no such things as ghosts in the real world. Their only existence in the netherworld of our subconscious and writers' imaginations. But when I looked, as Harriet did, at the photographs looking back at us, I knew that what had happened was real, and so began a haunting of another kind. A haunting that would ebb and flow like the tides, coming and going when we least expected it, but expecting it always, living in fear of it always, not knowing what it was capable of. Perhaps if the thought of suicide had presented itself, we might have ended our lives there and then, but it didn't. It never would. I guess we possess far greater fortitude than we ever credited ourselves with. Greater resolve too, determined as we were that Mother would never know of the haunting. We hoped as much as we expected that it would only be us he would subject to the torment, being the man that he was, for it was only we who had conspired against him. We quickly learned that that would be so. We also learned from what we would experience that he was more of a demon than a revengeful spirit intent as something as mundane as a mere haunting. We had wondered why our breasts were sore once again, like they were from Father's previous obsession with them. Initially we put it down to being just one of those things for any number of reasons. although try as we did to single out a common cause, we couldn't. It was only after we woke one morning to find an opaque stain on our white nightgowns in the vicinity of our navels did we realise the true horror of his visitations. Consulting the dictionary, we eventually found what we were looking for. Incubus, a demon believed to have sexual intercourse with sleeping women. The description was an accurate one, for we had and would never have any memory whatsoever of those nocturnal violations. As a result of what we had learned from that one snippet of information, we became interested in the supernatural, the paranormal, and with it we hoped a way to rid our lives of this abomination once and for all time. But it didn't happen. Our journey of discovery over the ensuing years was as daunting as it was enlightening. Our only source of books dedicated to the two subjects, the local library, with the greater majority having to be borrowed from other libraries in the state both near and far at our request, sometimes taking weeks to reach us. And like it was with any small country town of which Welcome was no exception, the news of our interest in such topics quickly became a matter of public knowledge, occasioning suspicion and ridicule from a small minority of its inhabitants. Mother, however, was well aware of the books and to their content, for we read them openly in the house, knowing it would be pointless trying to conceal what would be out in the open once we borrowed the first book. At the onset, she questioned our choice in literature. We knew she would, knowing also that she wouldn't be happy about it, which she wasn't. But other than the initial inquiry and her opinion of it, she knew she had no choice in the matter, as she acquiesced in silence from then on. Our explanation for our sudden interest when the inevitable "but why" was part fabrication and part truth, but it had to be, saying that with our studies of alternative medicines we discovered that the two had folklore connections dating back thousands of years, so we just had to satisfy our curiosity because of them. She often glanced our way with wary eyes as we sat reading, but whatever thoughts she had were never voiced. They didn't need be. Her face and mannerisms were an open book when it came to subjects she had little or no interest in or liking for, whether it be a wrinkled brow, a click of the tongue, shake of the head, pursing, pouting, disappearance of the lips, roll of the eyes. They all spoke volumes. No doubt the reason Henrietta and I developed a proclivity for the same as the years progressed, a matter of monkey see, monkey do. Yet we never developed a taste for elderberry wine, nor any other alcoholic beverage, as much to do with taste as it was to choice. Our only vice, if you could call it that, was the occasional Lucky Strike cigarette. Clyde chuckled. Mr. Chadwick smoked them when we partook of morning tea and lunch in the pharmacy office. The aroma of the burning tobacco so pleasing to our noses that we, and it was naughty of us, helped ourselves to two of the cigarettes from the open packet Mr. Chadwick had left on the desk. It was a spur-of-the-moment action that later that afternoon saw us standing and hidden behind the back shed like mischievous school children, eager to light our booty far removed from mother's eyes. The result of our first tentative puffs leaving us undecided and prompting inhalation, the effect of which was uncontrollable coughing, sputtering, and a wooziness that threatened to send us sprawling. A minute or two later, our composure regained, but still with watery eyes, we tried again, but with reservation, taking the smoke slowly in, then holding it for a second or two before slowly exhaling. Our reaction a pleasing one, where only minutes before we had wondered how anyone could enjoy it. But any thought that we would be able to hide our indulgence from mother was quickly dashed all but as soon as we entered the house. The residual smell of smoke on our hair and our clothes that we weren't aware of, gaining mother's attention the very instant we neared her. "You've been smoking," she said matter-of-factly. "Yes, mother," we replied sheepishly. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked. "Yes, mother, we did," we replied in unison as we looked at each other red-faced. "Good, but I hope you don't make a habit of it." "No, mother, we won't." Good, I'm glad to hear that. Yes, mother. And that was all she said, never to make mention of it again. What a delightful and totally unexpected insight into the sisters' lives, Clyde said. Who'd have thought it, eh? Too bad it wasn't that easy for us to come to terms with the disappointment we did and will continue to experience when we learned that there was nothing we could do to overcome the powers of an incubus. In one particular book there was a paragraph of startling revelation. A translation from a Latin book of the title of which escapes me, but went on to say that exorcism is one of 5 ways to overcome an incubi, the others being sacramental confession, the sign of the cross, moving to another location, and by excommunication of the entity. However, there was also a contradiction in the very same paragraph that stated, incubi do not obey exorcists, have no dread of exorcisms, show no reverence for holy things, the approach of which they are not in the least overawed. It was paradoxical, as it was futile to our way of thinking. Futile because we had long since lost our faith, and with it the choices we could have made, to tell Mother of the haunting, thereby freeing us of the burden and giving us the opportunity to seek help from Father Lachlan, the Anglican parish priest. The choice perhaps to attempt an exorcism ourselves, or if not an exorcism, at least the sign of the cross, augmented with the placing of a cross on our bedside cabinet. The choice perhaps to do all of those things, but we couldn't, for to do so without faith would be hypocritical, a pretense. So we did nothing, for there was nothing we could do. Then on a glorious late summer Sunday, February 15, 1942, following a picnic lunch under the shade of a towering eucalypt close to the base of Tor Hill, we experienced something so strange and beyond the incredible that we thought we must have been daydreaming. Welcome Reserve, since 1960 Welcome State Forest, had become a favoured place for our two-wheel adventures ever since we began to venture farther on our bicycles toward the end of 1941. The ride to and from was a strenuous one, but one that was always worth the expending of what at the time seemed the bountiful energy we possessed. The labyrinth of dirt roads that meandered through the 1 square mile area of native bushland beckoned us to cycle them time and time again, so often that we became intimate with their goings and comings, with the lay of the land and its features, and the animals that abounded in it as well. Henry and I delighted in the observation of kangaroos, emu, wombat, rabbit, hare, fox, and the proliferation of bird life that called the area home, or availed themselves of the native grasses, seeds, nectar, and the abundance of water from the free earth dams in the spring-fed creek. At one particular spot there was a rock pool of clear running water that was fed by the aptly named Spring Creek, surrounded by an oasis of verdant trees, shrubs, and lush ground cover, and a place we often spread our blanket to relax and partake of picnic lunch. Because of the abundance of food and water, it was frequently visited by many of the already mentioned animals, one of which on 2 occasions was a kangaroo of such immense proportions that it defied our imaginations, filling us with awe and, yes, a little fear as well. Couldn't be the same animal that Sandy mentioned, Clyde thought. Could it? Nah, not possible. No way. But then he didn't say how long ago that was. So maybe. The fear we experienced was only natural and to be expected at the sight of such an imposing animal. The thought of what it could be capable of making us feel fragile and insignificant by comparison, like it is when you're out in the open under a dark and ominous sky. It was an animal that demanded respect and to be distant from, both of which we did, not daring to move, not wanting or needing to move, but to just sit and look and admire and appreciate this marvel of the animal kingdom, until it had its fill and moved on. Tor Hill at the time, however, was nothing more or less than a notable landmark to us, as it was to everyone who lived in the Shire and just beyond. And like it is with any landmark, you notice it and then move on, as we usually did, to our other place that was far removed from the rugged terrain that the hill and its immediate surrounds were. But on this day we had stopped because of a flat rear tyre on Harry's bicycle, an inconvenience and one we were more than capable of remedying. 10 yards off to our right was an area of flat ground, well shaded and inviting, and one we took advantage of, and from where we mended the puncture, deciding then to remain and have lunch. Following our meal we lay down and stretched out using the cardigans we always carried for makeshift pillows, and in no time at all we began to doze. There was just a hit of a breeze rustling the leaves of our towering host, a pleasant soothing sound that, combined with the contentment a meal always provides, made for ideal conditions for one to lose themselves within themselves. So when I, Henrietta, heard a soft sighing, I thought it was coming from my sister. So I smiled and dismissed it. And it was then that I thought I was daydreaming. Must be daydreaming. For what other explanation could there be for the sight I witnessed? That Henrietta witnessed too, although I didn't know that at the time. Just above the granite boulders atop Tall Hill, stationary in mid-air was, and this is the only way to describe it, a bowler hat with a flat brim. A very large bowler hat, but a bowler hat nonetheless. Clyde said nothing, but he was thinking, bugger me, I'll be damned. They did have a close encounter. A strange looking object to be sure, but I'll be damned. I'll be damned if I won't. It was impossible to tell of its make-up, because even with the sky clear and the sun radiant there was nothing to give it away. No reflection from the black grey surface to indicate metal or glass or some such composite. Nothing. For all intents and purposes it was as it appeared, a bowler hat defying gravity. I didn't know how long it remained so, a minute, 5, 10, for time seemed to stand still, until a white light so brilliant that it hurt my eyes escaped from underneath it, bathing the top of the hill with its intense luminosity, and amid that light I saw a pyramid that began to slowly rotate and display its four sides of different colours, from red to yellow to blue to green, changing sequence with every complete rotation, as if the colours and their order were a signal to an unknown observer that only it could understand. Then as quick as a prestidigitator plucks a card out of thin air, the pyramid disappeared, and the white light extinguished, and from the slopes of Tall Hill, like spokes from many wheels, shot countless dazzling lights, all the colours of the rainbow, seemingly to throb, to pulsate as if they were living, breathing things, inhaling and exhaling and dancing about with carefree abandon. It was such a magical, mystical display that I didn't want it to end, wishing like a child on seeing a falling star for it not to end, for it to go on forever and a day. Wow, Clyde said, what a fantastic experience. Unbelievable. God, what I wouldn't give to have been able to experience it with them. Following a brief pause, but I wonder if that's the reason why they thought there was a pyramid inside the hill. It'd be reason enough for me, there's no doubt about that, knowing what I know now. But maybe it was different for them, something that just didn't enter their minds at the time. Perhaps. But it did end, and when it did, the object, the bowler hat, disappeared as well, leaving in its wake a lingering sigh like that of a child observing an illusion that defies as much as it had enthralled. When I finally looked at my sister through rapidly blinking eyes, alert from what I thought was a daydream like no other, she returned my look and asked me if I saw what she had seen, only to realise then that it must have been real, unless we both had the exact same daydream. It was an event we would talk about often, and every time we did we tried to capture the slightest nuance of difference between what we had seen, but there never was any. The following Saturday we returned to the hill. Our objective to climb the hill just to satisfy our profound curiosity as to what might be up there, and also to check the slope for any holes or fissures from whence the colourful lights had escaped. Dressed accordingly in tough drill slacks, short-sleeved cotton shirts, and wearing our sun hats to protect our faces and stout leather boots to protect our feet, a water bottle suspended from a strap slung over one shoulder, we began our ascent level with each other 10 yards apart. However, it wasn't long before their position became staggered, stopping as we did to quickly search for holes and fissures, and because one found the going easier than the other in any given location. From the ground looking up, the incline had looked steep, but once committed to it, it looked twice as steep, with the surface of the incline that had looked solid from below proving to be loose underfoot in many places, treacherously so at times. So much so that it was sometimes necessary to go down on hands and knees and claw our way. Shit, Clyde thought. Maybe climbing that hill is beyond me. It was on one such occasion that I became aware of how quiet it was. Henrietta too, when I glanced her way, perhaps sensing what I was thinking by mannerisms of copying a hand to an ear and shrugging. I nodded in confirmation. But it wasn't just quiet, but eerily so. And for a minute or two I was hesitant to go any further, for I had an uneasiness, a strange feeling of foreboding come over me. On my knees I reached for, then took a sip from the water bottle, then another, recapping the bottle, then let it hang loose once again. Finally, after gaming my feet and stretching, the feeling of foreboding gone, I continued on, taking note of where my sister was with furtive glances every 30 seconds or so, just to make sure that all was well with her. I was certain she reciprocated. For what to me seemed like hours, we eventually made it to the top of the hill, my legs so weak from the exertion that I was compelled to sit and sip my water, dabbing my face with a moistened hand, noticing as I did so that there wasn't the slightest hint of vegetation anywhere, just rock all around me that was the top of the hill. Henrietta, who remained standing, commented on the view spreading out before and below her, pointing to this, that, and the other, and saying she could see this and this and this, while I was content to sit and answer nonchalantly, "Oh really? How wonderful. Good for you," and so on. Several minutes later I was standing and looking at what my sister had been and telling her she was right about this, that, and the other. To which she said, "I told you so." Clyde smiled. He was enjoying the sister's anecdotal writings immensely. With my sightseeing over, I began to search, as was my sister, for any signs of something unusual that shouldn't be there and couldn't possibly be a natural part of the granite formation. Although what that might be we didn't know, but were certain we would recognise it if it was there. But search as we did, scrutinising every square foot of the rocky surface, we found nothing. Nor had we come across any events during our climb that would have allowed the escape of the coloured lights we had seen. That's not to say there weren't any, for we had but scratched the surface, so to speak, of an area so vast that any such quest would have been an impossible one, akin to finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. Deciding to sit for a while before our descent, our backs resting against the front boulder of the fall from whence the hill gets its name, we heard the sound we heard before, a drawn-out sigh that made us flinch and look at each other wide-eyed. Mouths open, the sun instantly hidden as if a blanket had been cast and spread above us, casting a shadow as dark as the moonless night to completely envelop the top of the hill. So afraid we were that we clung to each other, our cheeks moulded as if one, painful, bone on bone, flesh to flesh, eyes staring straight ahead, not daring to deviate, terrified as to what we would see. And when the light came like from a bolt from the blue, all before us ceased to exist and we clung to each other, impossible as it was, even tighter, a melding of body and soul. Perhaps we thought, if we were thinking at all, that this pierce of brilliant white light would incinerate us, when in fact it proved to be cooling and calming. Calm so reassuring that it had not been for the light we would have permitted us to look up to whatever it was above us without the slightest of hesitation. Then the magic happened, again. A pyramid appeared before our very eyes, as golden as the sun and so close we reached out together to touch it, only to see our hands pass through and into it. The effect like plunging our hand into cool water, but water that wasn't water as we know it. Must have been a hologram, Clyde said. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Intrigued, I slowly withdrew my hand to see if it was wet as it had felt on the inside of the pyramid, but it wasn't wet at all, nor was Harrietta's when she reciprocated a moment later. Making to return my hand to the wonderful illusion before me, it began, as it had done before, to slowly rotate. But instead of coloured lights, it displayed symbols, the like of which we, had never seen before, and therefore what message it displayed was lost to us. Nevertheless, the golden pyramid continued to turn unabated, the symbols, at first white, changing to black on white, as if perhaps to highlight them, and in doing so we might yet understand. But what secrets there were in them was unknown as the secrets of the universe. I was thinking, we don't understand. And it was then that the pyramid ceased to turn and the symbols disappeared. And then, what seemed to happen in the blink of an eye, the light that bathed the rocks vanished, yet still it remained. As strange as that may sound, impossible as it seems, it was none the less true. For it was like a vertical chalk mark on a blackboard erased of its tail, but the rest remained. What power do they possess, we would ask ourselves that night at home, to be able to control light in such a way at a whim? With curiosity getting the better of me, I reached out, expecting as before that my hand would pass through and into the pyramid, but it didn't. Instead, my fingers touched a surface as solid and as cool as the rock I was seated. Then with that touch it began to thrum. Instinctively I raised my fingers off of the surface, and instantly the thrumming ceased. Harriet in turn placed her fingers on the surface, and again it began to thrum. Delighted, she looked at me and smiled, and I smiled too, returning my fingers to the surface then. So we sat side against side, our faces beaming as the pyramid sang its own peculiar song, and as it sang it began to slowly descend. So serene we were that our minds were devoid of all thought, our fingers on the pyramid's surface as natural as they are on our own skin. Perhaps unconsciously we were guiding it down. We would never know. But down and down it continued on until, reaching the rocky surface, just for what seemed a second or two, it settled as would be expected. Then something incredible happened. Through solid rock it began to submerge, as if the rock were water and it too heavy to float. With our fingers clear we could only watch on, the thrumming now gone as it slowly but surely disappeared from view. And then it was gone. Then with its disappearance so too the light. Then with the light so too the shadow, leaving nothing behind but a sigh. And then that too was gone. Clyde sat back in his chair and rotated 90 degrees, forearms on the armrests, limp-wristed, to a standard for thought, let alone words. When his voice finally found him, he said but 2 words: "It's fucking unbelievable." Then his mind went into overdrive. I knew there was a pyramid inside that hill. I just knew it. Yeah, but is it still there? I mean, if it can be put there so easy, it's fair to assume it can be taken out just as easy. Must be a way to find out. There must be. And bloody X-ray vision is what a man needs. Hang on. Not X-ray vision, no. That ground thingamabob they used to locate the remains of those soldiers in France not too long ago. Ground piercing, ground, oh to hell with it. Get onto Google, you bloody idiot. He did, typing in ground piercing vision, then pressing enter, and bingo, ground penetrating radar. That's it. Scrolling down page 1, he located an Australian company second from the bottom. A good patriotic citizen as he was, when he could be, he clicked the heading that, with a blank when I revealed Orion Geoscience webpage, taking note of their email address before printing out the 3 pages of information for future reference, wasting no time then exiting Google and entering his email site. Following his study of the illustrated fact sheets and finding what he was after, he typed his request for a price of the unit he had decided on, saying in mocking jest as he did so, "Spared no expense I did, Charlie." He had absolutely no idea how much such a unit would cost, but if what he saw and read on the fact sheets was anything to go by, such technology, he expected, would not come cheap. He didn't care. $10,000, $20,000 was a small price to pay for the knowing one way or the other, and to finally put his mind at rest. Oh yes, a small price to pay indeed. With the email on its way at the speed of light, he closed the site, then straight away brought up the sister's writings, continuing to read, then from whence he had finished. What happened after that is a bit of a muddle, coming to us in bits and pieces, remembering what had happened with crystal clarity, but unable to fully remember how long we stayed on the top of the hill of the event, after the event, and what we did. Our descent of the hill, our riding home, and the emptying of our water bottles that we were certain we hadn't, but obviously did. We didn't tell Mother of the happening, the close encounter of the second kind, as it would be termed today. And we never would. I guess we thought that some things are best left unsaid, kept secret and to oneself. We often talked about what was impossible to ignore, reliving the extraordinary event that, for a little while, was far beyond those visitations of our demon father, paling into insignificance by comparison. But as often as we returned to the top of the hill in hope of another encounter, we never experienced it again. There is, however, no doubt in our minds whatsoever that it did happen, and no doubt either that that pyramid remains still inside that hill. And we have no doubt that it acts as a beacon, no doubt at all, for we have seen too many strange lights in the night sky over too many years, heading directly towards us, flying straight as arrows and drawn as surely a moths are to a flame for it not to be. But once that period passed, Father's demon visitations overrode the memories of that event, though certainly never to be forgotten. At this point it would be futile for us to go on and mention that was, for all intents and purposes, the mundane life that we lived in general for the next 68 years. After all, these writings are not an anthology of ancestry, a family tree. Suffice to say that the haunting and purpose of continued for and gradually declined over the span of 28 years, each year of which the frequency of the visits becoming less and less, from once a week to once a fortnight to once a month, and so on. Yet when reprieve eventually came, it came from nothing more miraculous than something as simple as the aging process. Death comes to us all sooner or later, but age generally claims us before it, yet is often responsible for it. We had lost Ruffles, our much-loved childhood friend, because of it, in the spring of 1943, aged 20, laid to rest by our hand beneath the shade of the apple tree she had once loved to climb. 27 years later, January 2, 1970, Mother passed away, aged 75, as much because of her age as it was of the pneumonia, laid to rest in a separate grave away from Father at her request. Being mature women as we were then, as opposed to the nubile nymphs Father once thought we were, was obviously not to be the incubi's father's liking, so we were left alone, never to be visited again. So with Mother gone, we had the house to ourselves. Free at last, we had a care in the world, with all the money we could ever need, and a pharmacy we decided to sell. Mr. Chadwick celebrated his 67th birthday in that year of 1970, and with the sale of the pharmacy the same year, he felt it was an opportune time to retire, leaving to the new owners, Mr. and Mrs. Price, to carry on in his footsteps. And so it remains today, Price's Pharmacy. All the family photographs were taken down and put away the day after Mother's funeral, but resolved just as resolute that day as it was all those years ago. We never travelled, never wanted to, even though we could have gone anywhere at any time regardless of cost, for as long as we so desired. But we did spend, buying whatever it was that took our fancy, if for no other reason than because we could. With the onset of drought in 1982, we decided to have a bore sunk in the backyard, hiring a gentleman from Coonabarabran, Mr. Fuller, who was reported to possess an exceptional skill for water divining. He was a delightful character but sure of himself, saying if he failed to find water, then there would be no fee for his services. But if he did, it was worth as much as what you thought the water was worth to you. I must admit I took several requests from for him to repeat that rider before we understood what he meant. But once agreed, we watched on in fascination as he slowly walked a path straight and true, holding two pieces of galvanised fencing wire in the shape of an elongated L, with a long back and short base, the two of which were gripped lightly in fisted hands. To and fro he ambled a score or more times, the two wire pointers turning this way and that as if they had a mind of their own. 3 times he stopped when the two wires crossed, standing his ground for a moment or two, as if to get a better feel for the wires and the story they told, before continuing on as before. But when he reached the site where the bore is now, the two wires spun as if out of control, and he propped, still as a statue, patiently waiting for the sign he undoubtedly expected, the coming together of the two tips to form a pointer. And when they did, he marked the spot with the heel of a shoe. No money changed hands then, for it was only a maybe. A week later a drilling team arrived, and 3 days later the water flowed. But what it was worth we had yet to consider. The bill for the drilling was $1,100, but without Mr. Fuller's uncanny ability the price could have been considerably more. So we based on the reckoning alone, we agreed wholeheartedly on an equal amount. Mr. Fuller did not complain. By the end of 1982 the drought still persisted, the long-range forecast showing little if any rain in the foreseeable future. In February of 1983 we had 2 25,000-litre water tanks installed, taking the advice of a chap who, after fitting the downpipes, informed us that the gutters had seen much better days. But we went one step further and rid the roof of the unsightly terracotta tiles, replacing them with a new roof of corrugated iron. In 1998, aged 78 years of age, a little frail and certainly not the women we once were, fed up with the inconvenience of having to wander the hall at night to visit the bathroom, we had a major renovation carried out by having an ensuite added to the master bedroom. Our bedroom, where ghosts of parents were long since past, and where we shared a double bed together, always together, for we would never have it any other way. On the morning of Tuesday, January 12, 2010, just before 6 a.m, I woke with a somewhat, but not unusual, urgent need to relieve myself and, as always the case, eased out of bed so as not to disturb my sister. But when I returned to my side of the bed and sat and began to brush my hair, I was suddenly overcome with the most awful feeling of impending doom. Frightened, I spoke my sister's name, and then again, to wake her, to seek comfort from her. But she didn't wake, nor did she stir, and it was then I began to cry. I pleaded her name, "Oh Harriet," again and again and again. And as the tears flowed I managed to stand, not bothering to wipe them away as I began to shuffle to her side of the bed, my heart pounding, my chest heaving, sobbing uncontrollably as I stood looking down at my beautiful sister, her eyes closing, seemingly asleep and peaceful, not wanting to, but having to, reach out a trembling hand to touch her brow, that I knew would be cold, so cold, because death had claimed her. Clyde found himself teary-eyed and stopped reading, overcome by a sadness for someone he didn't even know yet felt like he did. "Oh dear," he whispered. "How sad. How very, very sad." Needing a tissue by finding the box empty, he picked up his mug. Might as well get a refill while I'm in the kitchen. Went to the kitchen the long way round because he needed to pee. Filled his mug, nuked it, grabbed a new box of tissues from the pantry, a couple of biscuits from the barrel as well, returned to his desk feeling a little better, sat down, opened the box, pulled a tissue free, dabbed his eyes, blew his nose, tossed the used tissue into the waste paper basket, pulled another, wiped his nose, retained the tissue in his left hand, picked up the mug with his right, sipped again. He was feeling a whole lot better now. "My God, but you're a softie, Clyde, no doubt about it." But that was okay. He could live with that. No problem whatsoever. Early afternoon, Friday 15, I buried my sister in one half of a double plot under the shade of a native apple tree. Just me, the funeral director and his assistant. The only words spoken, those from me. Goodbye, my darling sister, my other self and kindred spirit. Rest in peace and do not pine, for I will be with you shortly, together again for ever and a day. I was certain that I would, more so than I was about anything in my entire life, for I began to do so that morning she had passed. Returning home, I was at a loss of what to do, so lonely and alone in a house so empty, and quite as if it was mourning for her loss too, as silly as that may seem. No, it doesn't seem silly at all, Clyde muttered. By the end of the first week following my tragic loss, I was spending more time in bed than out, though I slept little. I wasn't particularly hungry and I cared not, finding little comfort in food, nibbling dry bread and biscuits for no other reason than as an adjunct to a cup of black tea, as one would usually do. I had no interest but one, and even that was a labour at times. Those times I would sit before the computer screen for hours and not write a word, my mind as empty as my life, my body weary, my heart so heavy. I was pining away, there was no doubt about that, and I didn't care. And when my sister came to me one night, whether in a dream or not, I do not know, enveloped in flame of the hell she must surely be, I wept. I don't know if I woke in fright then, or continued to dream, but she spoke of a demon haunting her, as black as pitch and always there when the light came for her to cross over. Its one and only purpose to prevent her from doing so. She desperately pleaded for my help to rid her of it, holding out her hand for what I thought was a gesture of such, only to see fire erupt from the palms. And it was then that I understood, and I wept again. "Uh-oh," Clyde exclaimed. "I have a bad feeling about this." The fire spoke of purification. I knew that as surely as night follows day, and I was physically incapable of doing what was needed, so I wept. And there was no doubt that the demon, as surely was the incubi, was our father, for it could not possibly be another, and for that too I wept. The desecration of father's grave meant nothing at all to me, and I would have gladly done so with a bulldozer, if I were able, but using a pick and shovel was as impossible as for me to drive such a machine. Desperate, I tried to come up with a plan of some way to incinerate what remains there would be in the coffin 2 metres below the ground without the need to dig, but it was futile. I was too old, too lacking in imagination, too tired and overwhelmed by my desperation, and so ashamed that I had let my sister down in her time of unparalleled need, that I let myself waste away, and with my death I hope she would understand and forgive me for what I could not forgive myself for. Ah, so that's it, eh? End of story, Clyde said. He sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, stretched, picked up his mug and sipped what by now was cold, pulled a face, returned the mug to the desktop, deciding then to print the 15 pages of A4 text by 2, one lot for Sandy, the other for his records, sitting back as he waited for the printer to churn the pages out, and thinking, but it's not the end of it by any stretch of the imagination. No, is it? Oh no. Dear Harriet and Henrietta want me to be their knight in shining armour and do what is totally insane to beyond all reason. That's what it is, he blurted out. Fucking hell. Bloke have to be nuts to even think about doing something like that. Christ almighty, might as well turn myself in now and save all the hassle of digging. Running his fingers through his hair, he then gripped the headrest and stared at the ceiling, although he wasn't seeking divine guidance, but rather because his eyes simply fixed on it. And as he continued to stare, he had a thought that instantly erased all others. I wonder how long Harriet was dead before anyone found her. God knows, the poor soul. Oof. Okay, that's it. That's the sister's diary. Whew. Wow. Hand's gone to sleep. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I know I made a lot of boo-boos. Anyhow, I want to thank you for watching, and until next time, bye for now.